Hey guys, welcome back for another episode of The Suited Shootist. And what I want to talk about today actually kind of springboards off of an appearance that I made on the Primary and Secondary podcast a little while back. And basically, we were talking about how, sometimes optimal can be the enemy of practical. And let's just kind of get into what I mean by that. If you spend any time on your preferred flavor social media, whether it be Instagram, whether it be YouTube, whether it be Facebook, TikTok, what have you, there's a very strong focus, understandably, on the sort of measurable skills with a handgun. Whether that be your draw to first hit, whether that be the myriad of popular drills, the El Prez, the Bill drill, take your pick. And it makes sense. Number one, short format. Number two, it's standardized. Number three, it's measurable. So obviously a lot of that is going to be getting a lot of attention. And even some sort of defensive oriented pistol classes will have those kinds of metrics as part of the curriculum. A good example is the Green Ops Covert Carry class that I took a couple years back. The interesting side effect of it is this. I see a lot of people who, because a large concentration of the discussion around, pistol craft at large centers around those measurable criteria, they're selecting gear tailored towards that level of performance. And that's not inherently a bad thing. I'm in a fortunate enough position these days that minus the light, Glock 19 with a red dot is not an unrealistic proposition for me for a carry gun. It's not always been the case though. And that's really what I want to touch on, because there's a large segment of the bell curve where on the far right side you have the high performers, the real enthusiasts, where they're taking multiple classes a year. They have a very structured dry practice regimen that they're doing multiple times a week, things like that. They probably have a log book and those sorts of things. The middle of the bell curve, that center 80%, is what Pat Rogers would call regular earth people. And, those are the folks who are gun owners, they may be gun carriers, and they recognize the need to take control of their own personal protection, but they're not necessarily going to be about that life to the same extent that you or I might be. And that's why, for how many years running, the Ruger LCP has been one of the most popular carry pistols out on the market. I think it may have recently been supplanted by the P365 from SIG, but the point being is that those pistols are dramatically outside the window of geared to optimal performance. And so if on one end of the spectrum you've got something like a snub revolver, and on the other end of the spectrum you have what equates to effectively a duty gun, well, when the emphasis is so heavy on the shooting performance metrics, it's real hard to do a 2-second build drill with something like this. It's real hard to get the same kind of draw to first hit with an LCR, even in 22, simply from the standpoint of there's less of the gun to hold on to, and the sights are not as user-friendly, even when modified. So what does that mean? What that means is that I feel we need to be cognizant of the amount of emphasis that we put on certain things in terms of importance. And again, I'm not saying shooting performance isn't important by any stretch of the imagination. The challenge is that my theory, basically, is there is this second order effect of this being such a focal point of the conversation that normal everyday earth people are trying to shoehorn duty guns into a lifestyle that it's not necessarily conducive to, and they're having a hell of a time doing it. And so that's kind of the question I've got is how do you strike the balance of a rule one gun versus the gun that you shoot best? Because depending on who you ask, you're going to get different answers. There are some folks that say, well, rule one is to have a gun. It's a lot easier to have a gun when the gun looks like this than when it's, 3 times the size and twice the weight. So how do we balance that conversation? How do we put the appropriate amount of emphasis on competency without creating these artificial barriers to entry of saying, well, unless you're shooting, I don't know, a 15-second or a 12-second El Pres, then, you're not necessarily equipped to protect yourself. Because if it goes untempered, it's very possible for people, especially early on in this discussion, to come to those kinds of conclusions. And especially for those of us who have struggled through trying to find the balance of living their life and living an armed lifestyle, I think it's a conversation worth having. So how do you strike that balance? I gotta say that John Dobb did an excellent interview with Lee Weems on minimum standards. And Greg Ellifritz and Claude Werner, the tactical professor, have done some content on this as well. That all of that, I think, really does help to kind of quantify what the minimum expectations should be for someone who is going to be carrying a firearm for self-preservation. Now, the challenge is that those standards tend not to be particularly impressive. It's something like being able to clean the Gila Hayes 5x5 5 times in a row. Well, it's a 5-inch circle at 5 yards in 5 seconds. For any of us that have been within the training space for any period of time, that's not a particularly challenging proposition. I think the only pistol that I had that really gave me any trouble doing it was maybe the Keltec P32 and like the Ruger LCP2 in 22, and that's just because those sights are atrocious. But there are circumstances where those are the guns I carry. So again, this isn't necessarily so much to make a point, but to solicit some feedback, because I'm curious how you strike that balance. Now, obviously, there are going to be the people who, hell and be damned, the pistol is going to be the center of their decision making no matter what. And okay, perfect. If you've got a lifestyle that supports that, awesome. For those people that are not in that position, what is it that you suggest? Because carrying the gun you shoot best is not always necessarily the most practical option. And so, how do you recommend the compromise be struck? I really want to hear this, so put it down in the comments and let me know what you think. Aside from that, I hope everybody has a fantastic week. Stay dangerous and stay sharp.